Shocking accusations reveal the real killer of Vu Manh Long, billionaire tycoon exposed. What kind of power could hide the truth of a star's death for so long? The nation reels as Song Yiren's tearful revelation points to a figure no one dared to suspect, a tycoon worth hundreds of billions, now dragged into the spotlight. The history of Vu Manh Long's death has exploded into scandal, and the world is watching in disbelief. Let's join red carpet revealed to uncover the full story, right now. The room fell into stunned silence the moment Song Yiren's trembling voice broke through the chaos. Cameras clicked, flashes erupted, and journalists leaned forward, their pens frozen in midair. Tears streaked down her face as she whispered words that would set off an earthquake across the nation. Vu Manh Long's death was not an accident, not a tragic twist of fate, but the result of a deliberate crime orchestrated by one of the most powerful men in the country, a billionaire whose empire was worth more than 300 billion yuan. What kind of power could bury the truth of a star's death for so long? What kind of influence could shield a man from suspicion while millions mourned blindly? Those questions spread like wildfire within minutes, ricocheting across social media, spilling from television screens, and igniting a storm of outrage. For years, the official story had painted Vu Manh Long's passing as an unfortunate tragedy, a cruel twist that robbed the world of a beloved figure too soon. But now, that narrative lay in ruins. Vu Manh Long had not simply been an actor, a singer, or a celebrity. He had been the heartbeat of a generation. A man whose smile lit up screens, whose voice had carried fans through their darkest nights. His death had shattered millions, sending fans into collective mourning. And yet something about the way it had been explained had never sat right. Rumors had lingered in the shadows, strange inconsistencies in the timeline, odd silences from those closest to him, whispers of forces moving behind the curtain. But no one had dared to speak publicly. Until now. Song Yiren, his longtime friend and confidant, carried the burden of silence for months. The weight of grief had been unbearable. But what finally broke her was not just the pain of loss, it was the knowledge of betrayal. Standing before a press corps that had gathered for what was supposed to be a routine memorial, she collapsed under the weight of the truth. Sobs racked her body as she shouted the words that would haunt the powerful. The truth has been buried, but not anymore. The real killer is still out there, and his name is known. The name she uttered afterward was like a bomb detonating. Billionaire tycoon. A man whose business empire spanned industries from real estate to media to finance. For decades, he had cultivated an image of philanthropy, sophistication, and stability. He was the face of elite dinners, the patron of charities, smiling benefactor who appeared at cultural events draped in humility. Yet behind that mask, if Song Yiren's words were to be believed, lay a man capable of murder and cover-up, willing to crush anyone who stood in his way. The immediate reaction was disbelief. How could a man so powerful, so revered in certain circles, be accused of such a heinous act? But disbelief quickly gave way to shock, and shock transformed into rage. Within minutes, social media exploded with accusations, questions, and demands for answers. Fans of Vu Manh Long flooded platforms with hashtags like Justice for Manh Long and Tycoon exposed. Live streams of Song Yiren's breakdown went viral, clocking millions of views within the hour. The story had escaped containment. The Tycoon's public relations team scrambled into action, issuing cold denials and vague threats of legal action. Statements were released declaring the accusations baseless. The ramblings of a grieving woman overcome by sorrow. The more they tried to silence the storm, the louder it grew. Every attempt at denial was met with renewed fury. Every press release dissected by journalists and fans alike. In the court of public opinion, the billionaire was already guilty. The hours turned into days. More fragments of the truth began to surface. Anonymous sources came forward with the whispers of deals gone wrong, contracts signed under duress, and backroom threats that had followed Vu Manh Long throughout his final months. Some claimed that the star had been on the verge of exposing corruption tied to the tycoon's empire. Others suggested that his sudden death had been the final act in a long campaign of intimidation. None of the claims were fully verified, but they painted a picture too damning to ignore. The media pounced. Investigative journalists dug through financial records, unearthing connections between the tycoon and shadowy shell companies. Old scandals, once buried under hush money and influence, began resurfacing. Photos of the billionaire with questionable figures circulated widely. Slowly, A narrative took shape, not of an untouchable benefactor, but of a man who had built his fortune on ruthlessness. Silenced enemies with money when he could, and with fear when he couldn't. Fans of Vu Manh Long grew more relentless. Vigils outside the billionaire's headquarters swelled into protests. Crowds demanded accountability. Placards with Vu Manh Long's smiling face alongside slogans like "Truth cannot be buried" and "Justice for the fallen." Police presence grew heavier. But the gatherings only intensified. For the first time in years, the Tycoon felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Meanwhile, Song Yaron, once a figure known only for her grace and artistry, became the unlikely face of resistance. Her breakdown had been raw and unplanned, but it resonated precisely because it was authentic. Interviews showed her both fragile and fierce. A woman unwilling to back down despite threats, harassment, and relentless scrutiny. "Can try to silence me," she declared in one interview. Her voice steady despite her tears. "But I owe him the truth. Vu Manh Long deserves justice, no matter the cost." The billionaire's empire, once solid as stone, began to show cracks. Stock prices plummeted as investors panicked. Business partners distanced themselves, issuing careful statements that emphasized their independence. Politicians who had once been photographed shaking his hand now avoided his name. He had spent decades building an image of untouchable prestige, but within a week, that image lay in tatters. Still, the man himself remained defiant. From behind the gilded walls of his estate, he issued statements dripping with arrogance, dismissing the uproar as nothing more than hysteria. "I have nothing to hide," he declared on national television, his face calm, his tone patronizing. "The truth will vindicate me." But the people were no longer listening. His words fell flat, drowned out by the roar of millions demanding his downfall. The deeper journalists dug. Darker the story became. Whispers turned into documents. Documents into evidence. There were traces of transactions, strange disappearances of individuals tied to the case, and a trail of silence bought at astronomical prices. It seemed that for years, the billionaire had operated like a spider in the center of the web, strings invisible to the public eye. But with Song Yaron's revelation, the web had begun to unravel. And still, the biggest question remained unanswered: how exactly had Vu Manh Long died? And what role had the Tycoon played? Authorities, pressured by the sheer magnitude of public outrage, announced the reopening of the investigation. Teams of detectives combed through files once considered closed, interviewed witnesses, and pieced together timelines that no longer aligned. For the first time, there was a glimmer of hope that the truth might emerge. The world watched as the scandal grew into something unstoppable. News anchors spoke of it as a national reckoning. Clash between power and justice, wealth and truth. Commentators drew comparisons to historic moments when elites were forced to face the fury of the people. And through it all, Manh Long's face, bright, youthful, full of life, remained at the center. His death had sparked not just grief but a movement. And now that movement threatened to bring down one of the most powerful men in the country. By the end of that first week, it's clear that the story was far from over. The accusations had not only exposed cracks in the billionaire's empire, but had also revealed a deeper rot within the system itself. Questions arose about who had enabled him, protected him, and how many others had been silenced before Song Yaron's voice broke through. The truth was no longer a whisper. It was a roar. And as protests swelled, as headlines screamed, the billionaire's once gilded empire trembled. One thing became undeniable: Vu Manh Long's death was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of a reckoning. Yet, even as the storm raged, darker secrets waited to be uncovered, secrets that would plunge the nation into even deeper turmoil. The days that followed Song Yaron's revelation were unlike anything the nation had ever seen. What had begun as a sobbing confession from a grieving friend had snowballed into a movement that threatened to dismantle the empire of one of the country's wealthiest men. Streets that once bustled with ordinary life were now flooded with protesters holding candles, posters of Vu Manh Long's face, demanding justice. Every night, these glowed with vigils, their light defying the darkness of silence that had surrounded the case for too long. Public fury reached a fever pitch. Fans who had once filled stadiums to cheer for Vu Manh Long now filled public squares to cry his name in anger and sorrow. Their chants echoed into the night: "Justice for Manh Long. Truth cannot die." Strangers who had never known one another stood shoulder to shoulder, By a common cause. Online. Hashtags trended relentlessly. Videos of protests went viral, gathering millions of views within hours. Petitions demanding prosecution of the billionaire soared into the tens of millions of signatures, overwhelming government servers. Authorities could no longer turn away. Under immense pressure, a special task force was announced to reopen the investigation into Vu Manh Long's death. Detectives who had once closed the file quietly now stood before cameras, pledging transparency and thoroughness. The first time, the walls protecting the tycoon began to crack in the light of official scrutiny. The announcement sent waves of relief through the crowds, but also sharpened their hunger for answers. Journalists uncovered evidence that chilled the blood. Bank transfers linked to hush money. Confidential files detailing contracts Vu Manh Long had allegedly refused to sign under pressure. Emails hinting at threats veiled as business deals. Those who had vanished during the initial investigation suddenly reappeared, emboldened by the public uprising. Their testimonies painted a chilling picture of intimidation, coercion, and fear. Each revelation cut deeper into the billionaire's carefully crafted image of respectability. As the truth bled into the open, the billionaire's empire began to crumble. Stocks tied to his companies plummeted overnight. Business partners scrambled to sever ties, releasing hurried statements insisting they had no knowledge of his actions. Major investors withdrew, wiping billions from his fortune in a matter of days. His most loyal allies in politics began to distance themselves, fearing that his downfall would drag them into the abyss. Tycoon himself attempted to project calm. In a rare televised address, he dismissed the accusations as slander. His voice was steady, his expression unreadable, but the confidence he exuded only fueled the public's anger. "I have nothing to hide," he declared. "I have served this nation with honor. And these accusations are nothing more than the lies of a woman blinded by grief." But the more he spoke, the less people believed. Words rang hollow in the ears of millions who had already seen the mounting evidence. His empire of influence had always shielded him, but it was powerless against the collective voice of a nation. While Song Yiren refused to retreat. In interviews, she spoke with quiet determination. He was never far but her resolve unshaken. "He was more than a star," she said of Vu Manh Long. "He was a brother to me. Took him from us. I will not let his story be buried with him." Her courage inspired others. More insiders stepped forward, revealing stories of threats and cover-ups that had long been hidden. The case grew beyond Vu Manh Long's death. It became a symbol of every injustice buried under the weight of power and money. Investigation unearthed shocking details. Documents revealed that Vu Manh Long had been preparing to expose a corruption scandal tied directly to the billionaire's empire. He had confided in close friends that he feared for his safety. He believed the truth was worth the risk. Those fears, once dismissed as paranoia, now rang tragically true. The possibility that his death had been an orchestrated silencing rather than an accident left the nation reeling in fury. As protests grew louder, national media intensified their coverage. Headlines screamed across the world, "China's billionaire scandal, tycoon accused of star's murder." Analysts on global networks debated the implications. At one of the greatest reckonings of wealth and influence in modern times, candlelight vigils were held in cities abroad. Fans worldwide joining the chorus, "Justice for Vu Manh Long." The story had transcended borders. It was no longer a national scandal but a global cry for accountability. Billionaire's fall accelerated. Government agencies froze his assets. Authorities raided his offices, seizing documents and computers. Images of investigators carrying boxes out of his headquarters became front-page news. His once mighty empire stood in ruins, foundations crumbling under the weight of exposure. He spoke of fear and intimidation, of careers destroyed when they dared to resist. Stories poured out like floodwaters, each one tightening the noose around the tycoon's reputation. Inside the court of public opinion, the verdict was already clear. He was guilty. Not just of Vu Manh Long's death but of years of corruption, manipulation, and cruelty. Crowds outside his mansion grew by the day, chanting for his arrest, their voices carrying through the night. His gilded fortress, once a symbol of untouchable wealth, now resembled a besieged citadel. Finally, the authorities acted. The billionaire was taken into custody under charges of corruption, obstruction of justice, and suspected involvement in Vu Manh Long's death. The sight of him in handcuffs sent shockwaves across the nation. Crowds erupted in celebration. chanting as though a war had been won. Fireworks lit the skies in some cities. Not in joy at his downfall alone, but in vindication of the people's relentless fight for truth. Yet even as justice seemed closer, the pain of loss lingered. Fans continued to gather at Vu Manh Long's grave, laying flowers, singing his songs, and whispering promises that he would never be forgotten. His face adorned murals. His voice echoed in memorial concerts. Memory immortalized in the hearts of those he had touched. The billionaire's empire may have crumbled, but Vu Manh Long's legacy only grew stronger. The case became more than a trial. It was a reckoning, a confrontation with the dark reality of power and the courage required to stand against it. Commentators called it a Manh Long moment. A turning point in the nation's history where voices long ignored finally brought down a giant. Politicians promised reforms, though many knew it was the people's unity, not the government's will, that had forced a reckoning. In the end, Song Yiren's trembling confession had accomplished what few dared to believe possible. She had cracked the wall of silence. Through that crack, the flood of truth had poured. Billionaire Tycoon, once untouchable, was now disgraced. Manh Long, once a victim, was now remembered as a catalyst for change. And the nation, once silent, had found its voice. The story closed not with silence, but with a roar that carried across streets, across cities, across the world. It was the sound of people who refused to be silenced, who refused to let power bury the truth. Vu Manh Long's death may have been tragic, but his legacy had become unstoppable. And as the dust settled, one truth remained clear: money can buy influence, but it cannot bury justice forever. The billionaire was exposed, the killer unmasked, and the people had won. The storm that began with one tearful accusation ended with the unmasking of power itself. Vu Manh Long's death, spared beneath silence and denial, became the spark that ignited a movement, a reckoning that toppled one of the nation's most powerful billionaires. The truth, no matter how deeply hidden, cannot be silenced forever. And in the end, it's not money, not influence, not fear that triumphed. It was the relentless cry for justice from millions of voices united as one. Vu Manh Long may have been taken too soon. His legacy lives on, not only in the hearts of his fans, but in the history of the nation that dared to confront corruption head-on. His story will be remembered as more than tragedy. It will be remembered as the moment truth defeated power. Thank you for joining Red Carpet Revealed on this unforgettable journey of scandal, courage, and justice. Your attention and passion make every revelation possible. Stay with us as we continue to uncover the truths others try to hide. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you never miss the next explosive story. Red carpet has been rolled back once again, and behind it, the truth always awaits.